Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homelands of Indigenous people, including Dakota land ceded and taken in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The History Department recognizes, and many of our faculty and students investigate the complex and layered history of this place. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So welcome again. I'm Sarah Chambers, the chair of the History Department. I'm very pleased to have you joining us this evening for the History Book Club. Some of you are regulars, so you know how this works. Some of you are joining us for the first time. This series was started by my predecessor, Ann Waltner, during the pandemic as a way to sort of keep connected. But we've found it was so enjoyable, we've continued it past the pandemic as well, as it's a chance for alumni, current faculty and students, friends of the History Department to get together and hear about all the great work that our faculty and alumni are doing and the books that they are publishing. So the way we start out is once I'm done with my introduction, I will turn things over to our featured author for today, and we'll be able to hear a presentation about the book. Then we'll have about a half an hour of conversation between the author, Lowell Gudmundson, and my colleague, Patrick McNamara. And then we'll have time towards the end for your questions. So you can be putting questions in the chat at any time. And I'll put up a reminder as we get sort of to the Q&A time. And then as we get there, I will read them to our two participants and they can answer them. We have monitoring everything in the background, Clayton Smith from the Development Office, who helps us organize this series. And so we're very thankful to Clayton, who has organized things and will keep things moving. So today I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about Costa Rica after coffee, the co-op era in history and memory. I actually, ages and ages ago, was a study abroad student in Costa Rica, and I'm sure that's why I ended up going into Latin American history, which is my area, although I never went back to do research in Costa Rica, but it was really, I think, the spark that got me hooked on Latin America. And so it was a great pleasure when Lowell Gudmundson, who did his PhD here in 1982 and then worked in the university in Costa Rica, then moved to Mount Holyoke College, where he was a professor of Latin American studies and history, and now has retired and decided to complete the circle and come back to Minnesota. So it was a great pleasure to welcome him back to this area and hear about his latest project and invite him to share that with us on the book club. And we're joined also by my colleague in the History Department, Patrick McNamara, who was listed on your invitation as a professor of Latin American and Mexican history, both of which are absolutely true. But he is also an expert on Central America. Particularly, he works on issues of asylum and human rights. And so it's wonderful to have Patrick here as well for this conversation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Lowell to tell us a little bit about this really interesting book that covers kind of the rise and fall of all these changes in the coffee economy in Costa Rica.
So thank you, Sarah. I also want to thank Patrick for being willing to do this, and certainly Clayton Smith for all his help in setting this up. As a grateful graduate of the doctoral program here, and also as a recently relocated Twin Cities resident after 40 years or so, you can imagine how much of a pleasure this is for me to be part of the series. I want to start by pointing out that in my notes to self, I always put in high energy, high energy. You got to pull this off with high energy. So hopefully I won't I won't lose you along the way, but I am trying to be high energy today. I want to start with some odd parallels with that doctoral dissertation come book back from 1982, because there are a couple of kind of strange parallels that are probably worth mentioning. The first book, Costa Rica Before Coffee, was written in 1980-81 in a deep systemic crisis living in Costa Rica that was the birthing of the neoliberal era in Costa Rica, certainly in Central America. And ironically enough, this later book, Costa Rica After Coffee, was written as the neoliberal era came crashing to an end. I guess it was all the Spanish version, which came out first, was written in 2016, 2017. And I've thought many, many times since then of that apocryphal saying, may you live in interesting times. And certainly both books were written in sort of strangely interesting times. Another thing that's worth commenting on, I think, to situate a little bit where this comes from, is that after that initial thesis book came out, I spent about a decade thinking I was working toward an imaginary next book, gathering thousands upon thousands of data sets, or data points for data sets on the 20th century coffee economy in Costa Rica. And mostly, let's say, probate records, 1927 population census, 1955 agricultural census, all nominal, all sort of linked together in these data sets. But then ironically, it led to an edited volume, an article, an edited volume on coffee in Latin America in general, but to no monograph. And worse yet, I simply abandoned it. I went back for more than a decade thereafter to working on the topics that took me to Costa Rica in the first place, which was Afro-Central America. So you might be thinking, what is it that Costa Rica After Coffee is all about? And why did it coalesce when it did after so many delays and false starts? You know, trying to get interested in data sets from 15 or 20 years earlier is not the easiest thing. And in my case, at least. So there were probably let's say two steps with a couple of factors built in that actually led to the rebirth. The first was getting a NEH faculty fellowship in 2008-9, which allowed me to live in Costa Rica for those 15 months on the promise that I would be interviewing members of the founding generation of the coffee co-ops, which were founded beginning in 1960, and pretty much in a decade they were all created. A huge part of that was a research collaboration that I struck up at the university, the National University where I used to teach, with a very young and very accomplished Costa Rican colleague, Wilson Picado, who was working on a, what would you call it? He was working on a Green Revolution technology environmental history project on coffee. And as it turned out, we were interested in interviewing much the same cast of characters. So we made common cause and carried out these interviews mostly in the first half of 2009. The other thing that got me moving a little faster than I might have otherwise was, ironically enough, Donald Trump's victory in November 2016. But that only because it confirmed a number of things that I had already begun to see in Costa Rica, which in 2014 elected the first of 3 consecutive anti-status quo outsider candidates, virtual unknowns, who ran these kinds of outsider neo-populist or populist campaigns. And of course, won the presidency, but with virtually no party support in the Legislative Assembly. And you can imagine how effective their administrations were and are to this day. So seeing this, I was sort of forced to confirm or recognize that the National Liberation Party, the PLN, and its social democratic legacies weren't so much being abandoned as being as leading to a collapse, and that collapse was not going to have any remedy. So once I had what I'll call a double punch of clarity about who I was writing for and what I was trying to communicate, I won't say that writing became pleasurable. It's never been all that pleasurable, but it wasn't difficult. It really wasn't difficult. How easy was it? Well, teaching full time, I wrote 4 of the 5 chapters in a single semester. And without even writing until 2 a.m., which what I used to do in 1980, when our children were, 1 and 4, which made writing rather difficult, let's say. So the idea was to try and engage younger Costa Rican readers in thinking about the origins of the social order that they tend to take for granted because it's the only one they know. And you could say I was trying to talk about their Costa Rica after coffee, not mine, but rather the world that they were living in, and not focus particularly or only on the rightward drift of the dreaded PLN that was being rejected so thoroughly by that younger generation, of course, but rather trying to point out the structural logic of that drift to the right and that relatively different and new position of the coffee co-op members 40 years on. I was aided in that by the fact that both of our children, well, they're 40-somethings now, but in any event, they were both born in Costa Rica, and the number of nieces and nephews, you couldn't count on all the fingers of many hands. So in some ways, I had a window on that world to some extent. So what then is the book about? Well, I want to be very, very brief here, because if I've learned anything, in addition to looking for energy, it's much better to try and answer questions that people actually have than talk about answers they aren't looking for. So I'll try and be brief here. The first chapter basically tries to reinterpret or reposition the National Liberation Party as a right populist movement. It, after all, came to power in the Civil War of 1948 as an insurrectionary power, as an insurrectionary party, and highlight not so much the social democratic legacies of the coffee co-op movement, which they created as their prime electoral base for 30 years, but rather returning to its right populist or rightist roots, and in some large part because the coffee co-op members themselves had moved from a arguable bare majority of the population to a distinct minority, elderly and wealthier. And thus that electoral base no longer desired social democratic policies in quite the same way. Chapters 2 and 3, and now I think I would ask Clayton to show you the images of the some of the people I will refer to here. Chapters 2 and 3 are an attempt at a portrait of the coffee co-op members that I was interviewing, some 36 coffee co-op founding generation members, county extension agents, agronomists, et cetera, that worked in the 1960s and 70s. So in this first instance, it is Marco Tulio Zamora. The first picture was the one I took after I interviewed him in his home, and the coffee grows behind the house. And then, wouldn't you know it, 3 years later in 2012, he was visited by the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, in his home. The local government, still led by the PLN at the time, had chosen him as representative of a common, ordinary coffee farmer of a multi-generational coffee farm. And perhaps in comments, we'll have a chance to talk about just how clueless the party seemed to be in understanding what he represented and the challenges he faced in his life and as an elderly coffee grower. So the next image is of the only woman I was able to interview in the founding generation, Anita Asofefa. She and her husband, very small coffee producers, joined the co-op shortly after its foundation. Zamora was, in fact, the only adult independent coffee grower that I was able to interview who was an independent adult coffee grower founding the co-op as well. Anita joined with her husband, and shortly thereafter he died, leaving her with 10 children to raise. She continued as a member of the co-op. I certainly met her several times at the co-op meetings. And what she provided for me was an extraordinary portrait of survival skills, but particularly of the educational attainment of her children, 3 or 4 of whom had earned university degrees, when her greatest lament was that she only made it through primary school. The other picture is of Roman Rodriguez and his wife, Alicia Zamora. He provided incredible detail for me on the way in which people like himself, co-op members, created private enterprise on the side to develop nurseries and seedling outlets for the conversion to dwarf variety bushes in the 1970s. The reason that the coffee crop doubled precisely in that time period, and people took full advantage of bonanza prices thanks to the Brazilian frost. Chapter 4 is the one much more commented on by Costa Ricans, certainly. What it attempts to do is to shift the focus to the international coffee market and the emergence of the so-called gourmet market for high-quality coffees. I sort of summarize it by calling it from Java Joe and Juan Valdez to Starbucks and Café Brit. So Clayton, if you want to go to the next image. So what I did in that chapter was to basically say what happened here was that in the coffee co-op bonanza years of the 60s through the 80s, the harvest volume doubled, as I said, thanks to the dwarf variety productivity. But over the next 30 years, the harvest volume was reduced by 50%. At the same time that the highest quality bean percentage doubled. And the geographic location of coffee farming moved dramatically toward peripheries and to the south in search of the niche environmental ideal conditions to compete in the gourmet market. And I think you can see why Wilson Picado and I had a lot in common, trying to figure out what was going on at this time. What I did, particularly in the Spanish version, and much less so, well, let's just say in the Spanish version with images and the English version with words, was to try and show how this gourmet market structure emerged, first in Europe, where it had always been marketed that way, and then eventually in the Starbucks era in the United States. I have here 2 images that distill this particularly well. The first one on the left shows Juan Valdez and his beloved Conchita, his burro, taking their seats on American Airlines in 1988, when American Airlines, of course, committed to serving only Colombian coffee on its flights. And of course, this is yet another example of the way in which the lowest common denominator, humor, trendy social commentary, was a means of feel-good advertising, not quality advertising, even though the Colombians wanted to advertise quality only, but of course they knew our market better than we did, and they weren't about to give it away. On the right, you see one extreme example from the early 21st century of the complete victory of gourmet marketing imagery. in which Colombians are invited to follow the French lead and turn coffee into a branded trademark regional quality distinction deserving of higher prices. When I found that one, these all come from the Juan Valdez archives, of course. When I found that one, I knew that, that as they say, a picture really is worth 1,000 words. Finally, in chapter 5, I basically tried to return to this idea of explaining to younger Costa Ricans where the society that they embrace, that they live in, came from. And Clayton, once again, if you'll go to the last image, which is certainly not as interesting as the previous. But what I was trying to argue was that the coffee co-op era led to a societal transformation, a social modernization, an urbanization unheard of before, and an educational attainment that Anita Sofefa knew plenty about. So this graph claims to be a comparative population pyramids from Costa Rica in 1960 above and 2017 below. But as you can see, there's only one pyramid there. There's a pyramid above and there's a quart-sized liquor bottle below. And I'm not going to go into any detail about this, except to say that, as Sarah said, my first experience in Costa Rica was study abroad in 1972. At that time, something like 50% of the population of Costa Rica was 15 and under. And today, elder care, pensions, geriatric hospitals are the problem, not kindergartens and pediatric hospitals, right? This, of course, goes along with the fact that Costa Ricans today have a longer life expectancy than the US, a lower fertility rate than the US, a comparable age at first marriage to Massachusetts, not Utah, to the fact that 2/3 of university enrollment and 2/3 of diploma recipients are women. These things were unthinkable in the middle to later 20th century. Now, the final thing I'll say about the book is it makes its pitch in just over 100 pages. So trust me, it's not long-winded. I've been more long-winded tonight than the book is. So if this has piqued your interest, I really look forward to seeing what people want to know more about. And then being long-winded will be probably a virtue. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lowell. And I won't take too much time and I want to here, I agree with you, inviting our guests to ask questions as well. But first of all, I really want to take this opportunity to congratulate you on this really tremendous book. It is concise, as you just mentioned, but you deal with so many things, from the kind of identity myths that Costa Ricans have about themselves in terms of racial identity and democracy, and of course, their notions of the history and reality tied to coffee production. That's in the book. But more than anything, your methodology in terms, I'm not sure if the non-historians in our group appreciate what you've really done in terms of going back to research from 30 years ago and sources and informants and revisiting that material. And first of all, that your computers can still read it is a major accomplishment. But maybe this will be my first question. So of course, we always say historians really study change over time. And in this case, you've studied change over your own time and your own experience. In some ways, I was thinking there's a Costa Rica before Gudmund's son and a Costa Rica after Gudmund's son, if you will. What were some of those challenges that you faced? And then in just putting together the material, and then about your interviews, how many of the people recognized you from 30 years before, if you interviewed the same people, and how many were just stunned that you would come back?
Oh, it's a complicated question. When I was first gathering all this stuff back in the 80s and 90s, the idea was even then to study social change over time, sort of longitudinal and life course histories, grandparents, parents, or at the minimum a full life course of the people sort of being studied in archival documents, that sort of thing, right? And coming back to that material when I sort of decided, oh, I don't want to do it, right? It was really the example I was going to give about the joke that Wilson Picado made, which really did help me, because it sort of forced me to say, yeah, that would work, I guess. And it's not just chutzpah, right? So when we'd go do these interviews in his hometown, Heredia was where I lived, but we'd take, the microbus up there, and it was an hour more or less each way, right? So we had plenty of time to talk, going up and coming back. And I had said to him many times, I don't think anything's going to come out of this damn stuff. No, not the interviews. The interviews are going to be good. I know what I'm going to do with them, but all that old stuff, who's going to do anything with that now, right? And he said to me once, he said, well, isn't what you're doing Costa Rica after coffee? Why do you run away from the before coffee thing? Like, it's got to be original. No, it would be more original if you actually tied it and you actually didn't seek to distance at all in the autobiographical part of it. So, for example, one of the interviews is with a Chilean exile sociologist that worked with me in the 70s in the university. And so we're revisiting, God knows, many years after he had done the best thesis ever done on the coffee co-op movement. And so, but when we were talking, it was all about when we were teaching back in the 70s there, right? And actually conveyed a lot of kind of what was being argued in the book. And I feel I owe so much to Wilson in this, not only because he was so much younger. I mean, we're talking about somebody in his early 30s, right? He was so much younger that he could sort of breathe fresh air into this thing when I was jaded and, I'm not going to do it. He basically said to me once, I had no idea what you were after in those interviews, right? It was clear that he wanted to know about technique, farming technique, fertilizer, pesticide, everything, land use. So he had his questions tailored. And I told him, well, no, I'm just trying desperately to get them to talk. Because what I want is to listen deeply. I want to be able to hear not what they're individually saying, and certainly not factoids, because sometimes I knew more about their predecessors, their family, than they did. But I wanted to hear echoes, like what gets repeated. And you don't hear it the first time, you don't hear it the second time. When you transcribe them and you read them a couple of times, they sort of jump out at you. But oftentimes I would insist that I would write down the same day or the following morning a kind of list of phrases that the person used or references they used. And so I was looking for memories of the past, not the past as past, right? And I think that's what really was indicative of what I had been teaching for a long time about history and memory, right? And so I was sort of doing something that really wasn't the old data set stuff. And if it had been that, it would still be left there, I'm sure.
But the University of Minnesota, your graduate training influences are clearly in the book as well. The population data, the census data, the quantitative approach that was so much a part of the years at Minnesota, in addition to from influences from Bob McKay, for example, and others, and then Stuart Schwartz's influences here, I think, in terms of the political economy around his work on sugar. And now you have your coffee. You need sugar to go with the coffee, so this is part of our breakfast in the Americas approach. But could you talk a little bit about how those influences are with you still, in a way, in this autobiographical reflection?
So you mentioned Bob McKay. I'd also offer a shout out to Mary Jo Maines. In other words, I guess I took coursework with her, and Bob McKay just was endlessly helpful. And of course, this was when you were doing things on punch cards. So, it's a little different. I always remember that they had, in critiquing the dissertation, they had pointed out that, the chapter on women, family, household is more than twice as long as any other chapter. I think it could use being divided into two, but that really had to do with the richness of the sort of quantitative demographic material. And in that sense, I really took to heart the idea of, demography is destiny. And if you don't understand the numbers of population change, talking about social change is kind of, punching in the dark or something, right? Where I would say that Stuart's influence actually sort of predated my arriving at Minnesota in 1978. What I really wanted to try and do, and was sort of interested in doing, was what I would call prosopography or collective biography, which Stuart sort of pioneered for colonial Brazil, colonial Latin America. And what I was trying to do in the dissertation was an equivalent, let's say, of the coffee transition and the coffee dominant players, let's say, in Costa Rica in the 19th century. And the second project was predicated on the hope or the idea that maybe you could replicate that for medium and small coffee producers, named life course experience, right? And that's what I was trying to do in gathering all this information. And I think that's the reason that I went back to interviewing, because you recognize that without an oral history piece of that in the 20th century, it's going to be very dry and not very revealing, frankly, right? One sort of bizarre final comment on that, the only chapter of the book that was initially written, I think, in English was the chapter on memories, because I had targeted agricultural history. I wanted it to appear, if they took it, in agricultural history, because I thought that was sort of methodologically maybe not novel or anything, but more contemporarily interesting, let's say. And so that was written probably as early as 2014, but everything else was sort of written first in Spanish and real fast when I saw the world crumbling, let's say, politically speaking, and I wanted to get something out before it.
I wonder that kind of, since you wrote much of it in Spanish first, in really in a, therefore, kind of Costa Rican framework, I don't know if push is the right word, but I want to suggest that your book is much more than about Costa Rica, and much more. You said in your comments that you wanted, especially younger generation Costa Ricans, to know this history and their past, and how their lives that include access to higher education and a kind of global ecotourism economy, all of these things, where the foundations of that really are. But your book is global history in terms of really connecting the demand for these gourmet coffees with the people on the ground in Costa Rica and their lives. It's not, I'm teaching a Central American history class right now, and I'm going to be lecturing on your book. I didn't assign it. I didn't have it, but I want to use it next time. I don't know if you remember, but you also came and spoke to that class in the early 2000s when you were doing the Afro Central American work. But I mean, how do you reflect on that idea? I mean, I think you've written real global history here that's about the connections around this commodity, not just for Costa Ricans as well.
Absolutely not. Well, I answer in two different ways. The foreword to both Spanish and English versions, I sort of touch on it by saying the two people that I owe sort of everything to in terms of entree to these Heredia and Tarrasu coffee zones, Wilson Picado being the entree to Tarrasu where he grew up, and Jose Antonio Salas, in my former research assistant in Heredia. But the issue there is that we all three are obsessed and motivated by autobiographical issues. That is, we all grew up in family farming modernization environments. What happened? How did it happen? Where did it come from? So, for example, I grew up in North Dakota. Half of the farmsteads are abandoned or plowed under, right? Coffee co-op modernization means with each generation, half as many commercial producers, right? And another example, let's say, of this issue of why I think it is a global history masquerading as a sort of pride of place, nostalgic, I was in Costa Rica and look what I saw, that sort of thing. But I think I'll give you the example. Tarrasu is the epicenter of the highest quality coffee known to humankind. So much so that the microprocessor industry, the micro producer industry, if they're able to establish contracts, they first were with Japanese and South Korean marketers, and then Dutch and German marketers, they are capable of producing small batch varietals and selling it for 20 to 30 to 40 times the average price of good Costa Rican coffee. And so there's something about the gourmet market that, at least in Wilson's experience, is just overwhelmingly causal, right? Making people in Tarrasu change the way they produce coffee, not abandon the co-ops, but strike out on their own as well. And a final example of the same thing, talking on all those bus trips with Wilson, the whole point was he was the youngest of 10 in his family. And he reflected intensely on how his elder siblings were victims of the lost decade of neoliberal contraction, the 1980s. None of them were able to achieve the educational attainment that he had access to. None of them were really positioned as well as Anita Asofefa's children because Tarrasu had no university, whereas Heredia had the university the Chilean and I were teaching it, right? And so, there is a really kind of universal global thing going on there in the exemplars well, I think it was also motivation to do it, that I felt, the old Costa Rican data gathering shtick I wasn't too excited about it, but understanding right populism, people who lived through the 1920s and 1930s didn't need to be reminded. Whereas we today are we just imagine somehow that rightist and populist don't go together. Well, they can go, and every bit as well as left and populist. So,
in that regard, I wonder, so one of your arguments is that in the gourmet era, the previous era of the co-ops you call the green and white era because it coincides with the PLN, whose colors of their party are green and white. And I remember I lived there in 1985 and 86 for Oscar Arias's election. And there are green and white flags everywhere. And then Calderon, his opponent, with his blue and red flags. And they had distinctive car horn honks. I don't know if they still do that.
Yes.
Whole scar, beep, beep, and people drive around for hours. And Calderon was beep, beep, beep. But if so, your argument is that in the post green and white era, coffee harvests have declined. But if they're getting more per pound or per bushel or volume or whatever it is, are they making the same amount of money, or are they even making more?
Well, okay. So there's several different things going on. One, of course, there simply are proportionately far fewer people working in agriculture or working in coffee. The people who are still working commercially in coffee and not as a side gig, right? The people who are doing it commercially are of necessity larger scale. They don't necessarily have the abandoned farmsteads of North Dakota, but a similar process of if you're gonna survive, you don't necessarily have to get bigger, but an effective microprocessing niche producer right now requires a financier, a marketer, an agronomist, hopefully in 2 people only, and $500,000 to start. So obviously that's not open to everyone, and the banking system no longer lends to agriculture, much less to coffee, right? So those who have survived are doing just well, thank you, but they are painfully aware of the fact that they are not only an electoral minority, they are a demographic, social minority that no longer establishes sort of electoral behavior, even in the coffee districts, right? So both the Calderonista party, they collapsed first out of scandals, and then the PLN went down the drain with them. Those two together couldn't win a majority election today, which is stunning when you think of it, right? I mean, I was wrong in many predictions about this. So the people who are doing spectacularly well, and who knows for how long, are the winners of the niche marketing, micro producer, varietal specialties, prepared for these incredibly wealthy or demanding foreign purchasers. The coffee industry as a whole, I would say, is doing quite well, in part because everybody wants their coffee, even if it's not niche market. So for example, Starbucks has traditionally purchased something like 15% of Costa Rica's harvest. Now, co-ops are legally prevented from selling more than 10 or 11% to a single buyer for fear of bankruptcy and not getting paid, right? But the gourmet market has rewarded Costa Rica's extraordinarily high quality. Anyone who's still producing commercially has done okay. Now, at the same time, Costa Ricans, by and large, are not picking the coffee. It's essentially Nicaraguan and Panamanian immigrant labor in relatively poor conditions, although since coffee picking is paid by volume and a minimum wage is set by the amount picked, the deterioration of the minimum wage has been much less significant in coffee than in bananas or than in pineapple or sugar or anything else where it's just by the hour.
Well, I don't want to mess up your metaphor of green and white, but it seems Starbucks is also a green and white era, since that's their company colors. But well, the last thing is I drink coffee every day. So this is a book that is dear to my heart. And I guess the Starbucks closest to me has unionized, one of the only a handful in the country. So I still allow myself to go there sometimes. But right now, I'm not a big fan of Starbucks. Not that I've always have, but I'd be interested if other people have questions.
Sure, we are starting to get some
Okay.
questions in the chat. Richard Chapman asks, were the coffee co-ops entirely homegrown indigenous affairs? Presumably there was some external investment. Any role of external, governmental, non-governmental, religious actors in their formation, significant or negligible?
Chapter 3, the memory chapter, has a sort of a detail, let's say, on that. The push behind it, I would argue, was overwhelmingly the National Liberation Party, Pepe Figueres's nationalization of the banking system, and the redirection of credit overwhelmingly toward entities precisely like the coffee co-ops. The extension, let me be careful here, the agronomist / extensionist, county extensionist, they got their very first sort of infusion of technical know-how or training in ways that were related to church support, only in the sense that they were sent to Catholic universities in Canada for training in organizing co-ops, sort of like the 4-H model, that sort of thing. But the official church connection to it was minimal, in some large part because the PLN was pitching it as its kind of social democratic, secular, innovative policy. And I guess the other thing that I think the book makes very, very clear, and that Marco Tullio Zamora is indispensable for. In that district in Heredia, the Zamora family was the dominant player as producer, right? They were themselves, they didn't have a processing plant. They themselves, turned over their harvest to the 3 dominant private corporate processors in Heredia. But the Zamora family in some ways split. And they always referred to each other as the rich and poor. And none of them were poor, mind you. And in fact, one of the Zamoras who committed to the co-op side was a very large grower, right? So there was clearly a kind of National Liberation Party loyalty test in which those who wanted to support the agenda of the party felt some pressure to support and to invest in the co-ops and process their coffee with the co-ops. Now, the idea of the co-ops was never, ever to replace private processors. It was simply to provoke increased competition such that better prices would be paid to all producers, regardless of whether they were processing coffee with co-ops but without co-op processing plants, there was no such effective pressure to raise incomes of coffee-based farmers.
Lowell, Patrick has already sort of referred to your really fascinating chapter that's this global history of coffee marketing and the differences between how it was marketed in the US and Europe, and that we go from the US having mass consumption of pretty cheap coffee, and with the rise of industrialization, sort of the coffee break, and they can go to the break room in their factories, and then a real decline in sort of per capita consumption of coffee. And then these marketers are trying to figure out, well, we need a new marketing niche. And so the Starbucks to the younger generation, the college students and everything. MJ put in a sort of link to and reference to the kind of fair trade movements, peace coffee. How did that fit into these different, shifts to gourmet coffee, microprocessing? Where did the fair trade fit in?
I'm going to go to that in one second, but Patrick was sort of enchanted by Gus Comstock and the guy that drank 80 cups of coffee and all that. But that chapter was kind of a survivor's labor of love, because in the edited book on coffee in Latin America, 2 of my dearest colleagues did chapters or did essays that I thought people didn't know of. Mike Jimenez's chapter on the history of the coffee break, and then Bill Roseberry's chapter on yuppie coffees, right? And so what I was doing was shamelessly plagiarizing. Both of them passed away very young, right? And so I was basically saying, this is what I want to say, even if it's borderline, like there's nothing original in that. So I was regurgitating a lot of that stuff. I am coming back to MJ's question, but sort of also at the same time, trying to, how can I put it, position the marketing campaign as itself immersed in a coastal hyperurbanization process in the United States. It's because the coasts were Europeanized, not because they were sold a bill of goods by Starbucks. No, it's gentrification and social differentiation among younger people. And whether it's residential gentrification or job market complexity, that's where the process gets its oomph in the United States. So I was trying to, let's say, take Bill Roseberry's yuppie coffees and move it even further into the future. Now, when I was in Costa Rica trying to do this, we were living in Heredia, and completely by chance, this wasn't conspiratorial. We were living right across the street from the headquarters of the co-op. And I thought it would be easy to sort of, be chummy with them and get access to a list of the founding generation. Oh, Lord, it took me 3 months to get anywhere with them. And the precondition, the only real break I got from them was, well, if you come to the meetings, then maybe we'll take you seriously. But then they talked to me and they knew I was from Minnesota. And oh boy, Caribou coffee. Caribou's paying a higher premium. What do you know about Caribou? And so I had a trade good to sell them, right? I didn't know anything about Caribou. I had never even drunk Caribou coffee, but they wanted to know. And I was shamelessly, pitching it. Now, the question though, I have in the Spanish version, I think there's there are some images in the Spanish version of the ways in which the co-ops tried to play catch up by selling fair trade emblems, by selling environmental little frogs, on the packaging, right? But the co-ops would be the first to tell you, none of that is any more regulated than the supplement industry in the United States. And so they're basically trafficking and trying to pitch things that are feel-goodish, but that don't actually go as far as that French-inspired image of trademarking origin, right? So they're trafficking in it, hoping that it'll give them a minor edge, but they're not actually producing under conditions sort of inspected by anyone, frankly, right? The niche market people are very attuned to that, but they can afford to be with that $500,000 investment and the fact that they're only cultivating 3 acres of this stuff, right? They're doing batch, lots essentially. And so in that sense, they can practically, serenade the plants overnight if you have to, right? Well, maybe that's a little bit too nasty, but yeah, but it really isn't a big part of the push toward how best to do coffee in the 21st century in Costa Rica. Unfortunately, but no.
Richard has put another question in the chat. I appreciated the book's introductory comments about Costa Rican exceptionalism. The coming of neoliberalism to Costa Rica, as in other parts of Central America, clearly has similar outcomes in broad outline. But is there still a case to be made for Costa Rican exceptionalism in your story, or at least distinctiveness?
Yes, they are exceptionally universal. Let me explain. So my beef with exceptionalists, it has to do with the sort of hyper-nationalist and very often racist attitude toward fellow Central Americans, right? Well known. Where I think there is something to be said for this, okay? For an idea of a 21st century Costa Rican exceptionalism. A flippant answer would be nobody else ever got an Intel assembly plant, right? And they were the very first to tap into the high-tech outsourcing industry throughout Central America. But even that I would qualify. In other words, while it's true that compared to their northern Central American neighbors, the demographic transition is all out of comparison in some ways. The educational attainment levels really quite unique. But compared to Panama, it's much less obviously distinctive, certainly in the demographic aspects, and not surprisingly, because the neoliberal success story in Costa Rica was creating this export-led mid-tech, high-tech hybrid. And of course, if there's anything that Panama was ever good at, beyond parking money, that's what it was and is today. So in that sense, yes, Costa Rica is Central Americanly exceptional in some ways because its neoliberal experience was highly successful in its own terms. That did not mean that everyone benefited directly from it. And it also explains why drug trade violence is leading to a doubling of the homicide rate every 5 years, in which Costa Rica has a homicide rate that is rivaling that of Mexico now. And this was completely unknown 20 years ago. And so, it's a complicated picture.
Speaking, I'm always struck that Costa Rica also is the place where every Major League Baseball is manufactured in a Rawlings plant as part of the neoliberal trade model. And these people are sewing 55 hand stitches to little leather balls and earning literally pennies on what the Major League pays for them.
And every time you go to the store and buy a Costa Rican pineapple, and I would defy you to be able to do that without buying a Costa Rican pineapple, you ought to know that just as with coffee, the hyper-exploited labor force is overwhelmingly guessed, shall we say. It's not undocumented because Costa Rica has sort of come up with a scheme for semi-documenting Nicaraguan and Panamanian labor. But, when you pay $2.99 or $1.99 for that pineapple, it's touched many hands that earned almost nothing. So it is a polarized neoliberal success story, for sure.
Well, I really want to thank Lowell for sharing this fascinating book with us, for Patrick for coming with really great questions and contributions of his own, and to all of you who tuned in today. I'm going to invite you, if you want to stay on the line, once we close out the session, we'll open up your mics and you're welcome to just have a little chat time and greet Lowell and Patrick. But first, I want to sort of close out the formal part of the program. We've recorded the event, and if you signed up, you'll get a link to that in your email. Upcoming events, we had planned for October to have a discussion with visiting professor from Ukraine, Alexander Komarenko, but he was not allowed to leave Ukraine this fall semester. We are very hopeful he's going to join us for the spring semester and that we'll be able to reschedule his talk at that time. But we will then have another meeting in November on the 15th at the 6 p.m. time when Paul Barkley, another graduate of our program and professor of history at Lafayette College, will talk about his very intriguingly titled book, Kondo the Barbarian, a Japanese adventurer and indigenous Taiwan's bloodiest uprising, in conversation with our professor of Japanese history, Hiromi Mizuno. I think Clayton will put some links into the chat. You know, the reason we have these wonderful books is that our graduate students were supported in their dissertations and have gone on to publish great work. And so if you are so moved to make a donation to those fellowships, we invite you to do so. And he's also put in the link for the next talk. So with that, thanks again to Lowell and to Patrick. We'll close it out, but you can stay on and talk to them if you'd like.